Good afternoon. In a recent New Yorker magazine, there was an article called Yellow Fever. In that article, Adam Gopnik wrote the following. The explicit goal of the National Geographic Society and of its house journal was to show the world to the worldly, to enlarge the map, and to support exploration with grants and medals. But the real task of the National Geographic, according to many, was to show white people who rarely got far from Cincinnati or San Francisco what lay beyond their ken. In the view of some in academia, the magazine's real agenda was to show readers where America stood in the great maw of geological time and in the great chain of creation, and to reassure them that they stood at the top of both. This is the first issue, which came out in October 1888, 125 years ago this month, and was originally a quarterly. The second print of the magazine was Judd and Detweiler, founded in Washington, D.C. in 1868, and they started printing in 1901. The previous printer had only printed in black and white. By 1906, they had grown considerably and had built a new brick building at Pennsylvania Avenue and 11th Street in downtown Washington. On the left is a request for estimate dated January 14, 1901, and on the right the invoice for the January 1903 issue that they had already started printing. The run at that time was 5,000 and would soon grow to 25,000. The bill for the 38-page magazine plus cover and shipping was $155.52. This is the new Judd and Detweiler building, built in 1916. It was added on to many times as the company grew until by the mid-20s it occupied, according to the Inland Printer magazine, over 43,000 square feet. And by 1924 they were printing by sheet-fed letterpress over 1 million copies of the National Geographic magazine each month. This issue contained the very first illustration in color. These are the images. They were separations made from hand-colored black and white photos. And this is the first reproduction of a true color photograph in the magazine rather than hand-colored black and white photos. 2 years later, a series of beautiful autochromes appeared in the April 1916 issue of the magazine. The plates were made by the Beck Engraving Company for National Geographic, using optically filtered separations from original autochromes. They were retouched to make the color more vibrant and realistic. One can see here the extensions to the original building on the far right as the company grew. In a book celebrating their 100th anniversary, Judd and Detweiler showed many interior shots of the printing plant, one of the largest in the United States, due in large part to the huge contract with the NGS. The Cottrell sheet-fed letterpresses in the upper left image are the same that printed in the National Geographic magazine in round-the-clock shifts. By the late 1920s, they were already printing, as I mentioned earlier, over 1 million copies a month. This is a view of the dedicated Cottrell letterpresses that only printed the National Geographic magazine 24/7. They were called ponderous. By the mid-50s, the National Geographic brass realized that there were problems ahead. The membership had reached 2.25 million, and the projections were that they would hit possibly 4 million by the early 60s. The NGS board worried that Judd and Detweiler would not be able to keep up with the projected increase in membership. This is Judd and Detweiler in happier times, 1950s snapshots of printing the National Geographic magazine. In their 68th anniversary book, there's a post-mortem page about the loss after 57 years of printing the National Geographic magazine. Many people today who look at those issues through the 50s do not realize that all those four-color process images were printed by sheet-fed letterpress. J&D struggled to recover from the loss of the National Geographic contract. During the 20s, Judd and Detweiler printed black rules around all the four-color images to help disguise any misregistration. Many of the illustrations in the magazines from the 20s were reproductions of paintings which were often easier to make color separations from. These are from the 1925 issue full of cow paintings. So I'd like to back up here a little and talk about the general quality of sheet-fed letterpress four-color work that was being achieved at the same time that Judd and Detweiler was really gearing up to print those millions of copies a month of the National Geographic. This is an amazing volume achievement in photo engraving and letterpress printing, 1927, and was published by the American Photo Engravers Association. It was meant to show samples of the state-of-the-art in photo engraving and letterpress printing in North America. It's an amazing document and shows that all the major hurdles in printing fine-quality letterpress had already been overcome. As it turns out, the major issues in printing four-color using letterpress were not in the mechanics of actual letterpress presswork, but in problems with color separation. The letterpress images in the book, especially the color work, is phenomenal. I believe that it shows that by the 20s, printers had figured out a great deal about the printing of multicolor and process. In fact, the high quality of printing that we associate with the National Geographic Magazine was clearly already in place by the mid-20s. As Louis Sibley mentions in his 1951 book, A Half Century of Color, a careful analysis of the color plates of this book showed that only 28 four-color reproductions furnished were photographs, and only 16 were true four-color separations from photo originals. The rest were made, like these, from paintings. So all the other color images were separated in process cameras from paintings or black and white originals, or used other mechanical means of separation. In achievement, there were 186 oil paintings used as subject material for four-color reproduction. This clearly shows that direct color photography and separation was lagging far behind the artistry achieved in the handmade mechanical methods. In the achievement book, Gilbert Grosvenor, the president and member of one of the primary founding families of the National Geographic, wrote an essay about photoengraving as an ally of science. As it turns out, Grosvenor knew of what he spoke. Most color letterpress printing required huge amounts of color retouching and color interpretation. Here's a view of the typical color retouching studio in the 20s. In the book, a large section details the enormous amount of hand skill and experience needed to make photo engravings and four-color reproductions. I'll very quickly go through this section just to give you a tiny taste of the many highly skilled steps that one had to go through. Photography, stripping and printing, zinc etching, copper etching, routing and blocking, finishing and proofing, then tint laying. From this enormously long list of highly skilled and meticulous steps, one appreciates how developed and sophisticated the process of letterpress printing had developed into by the 20s, and puts some of the accomplishments of the images in the National Geographic in perspective. But they still did not have a real handle on accurate non-mechanical color separation techniques. They could achieve beautiful color, but it was by highly skilled manipulation by way of tooling, etching, and hand masking. In the frontispiece, this definition reveals a lot about the state of color reproduction in the 20s, and the key words here are interpretive and skill and artistry. The details of high-quality letterpress printing had been worked out by the mid-20s. Screen rulings, how much to etch halftone plates, undercutting halftone dots, which papers yielded the best results, all of these mechanical details of fine-quality letterpress printing were already there. Another important book that came out even a little earlier than the achievement in photo engraving is this book. Its title is Commercial Engraving and Printing by Charles Hackelman. It was the Bible in terms of letterpress production. This book, printed 3 years earlier than Achievement, also clearly details that the photomechanics of fine letterpress printing have been pretty much overcome. The lower right image is an astounding 400 line per inch halftone printed image. A large section of the book details the fine points of color retouching and etching of color in monochrome plates. This shows a typical late 1940s color etching retouching studio. Notice the fabric samples in the lower right used for matching from the original. The next set of 3 slides shows the amount of handwork, re-etching, and color correction needed to accurately reproduce this oriental rug. This shows the extent of retouching and mechanical reworking possible under the hands of a highly skilled prepress worker. Even in the 50s, hand-cut masks were still heavily used to correct color. Here is a hand-cut mask used to reduce magenta and black from the dress in the process 4-color plates. And here are the final results. I'm showing these to show the state of color separation techniques in the 40s and 50s. They show how typical the look of the color in National Geographic printing was of that period. And letterpress color as displayed in the National Geographic was not only a result of the relatively unsophisticated methods of making color separations, but in addition had the burden of the use of more opaque letterpress inks, which helped contribute to what some would call the muddy look we are familiar with. Offset, still not as widely used, had the pros and cons of using more transparent inks. The image on the left shows a relatively common method of color separation, in quotes, during the 20s and 30s, and one that has color that is totally synthetic. The original of the image of the canoers in Maine was created from a black and white photograph. Again on the left, a truly innovative set of 3 colors is used. At the same time, there was a huge amount of experimentation on different options for color separation, with all sorts of hybrid and alternative methods of getting pleasing color results. The image on the left shows the results from a special 3-color process set. Many of the 4-color images in the National Geographic, like these from an issue in 1927, are drawings and paintings, as previously mentioned. This was printed in the same year that the book Achievement in Photo Engraving came out. Here one can see, by looking carefully, edges of the hand color masking of the separations. Some are much more evident than this. In the same year, in the same issue, these balloons in the National Geographic are completely color corrected by hand-painted masks, and the edges and some errors are very easy to see. Unlike in the 20s, when it was rare, by the 30s most color images were separated from color photographs. The original photos were either Lumiere autochromes, Finlay color photos, and later Kodacolor, Dufay, and APHA color. The reproduction color is still funky for the most part, but then the original photograph color was not the color we expect today either. By the 50s, registration with the Judd and Detweiler printing was much improved, and the black rules around the images were gone. The 4-color separation work was also far better, with much better color masking. The letterpress color is contrasty by comparison with 4-color offset of the same period. One of the few pioneering magazines that made extensive use of high-quality 4-color offset lithography was Arizona Highways, and the difference was noticeable, but they had much shorter runs than the National Geographic magazine and therefore were able to use offset. An image from the issue at the time in 1957 when Judd and Detweiler announced the loss of the National Geographic contract. This image of Mont Saint-Michel is a great example of the quality of the color reproduction which developed and improved until the end of the 50s. Yes, the color is still what we now call dirty color, i.e. olivey sorts of greens and a rather heavy uncorrected color palette, at least by today's standards, but many of us like that look. In that same issue, an extreme blow-up of the 150-line halftones reveal the typical slightly hollow letterpress dots in the line screen. This is the cover of the historic last issue produced by Judd and Detweiler by sheet-fed 4-color letterpress. Although the contract change was announced in 1957 in the Washington Post, the contract did not end and the switchover did not happen until April '59. This is the cover of the first copy after the switch from Judd and Detweiler in '59, and it looks pretty much the same, but it was now being printed by RR Donnelley in Chicago by heat-set, high-speed web cylinder letterpress, but still letterpress. How did the search for a new printer end up with a selection of RR Donnelley? In 1936, RR Donnelley printed the first mass-production Life magazine using high-speed letterpress thanks to a brand new kind of ink that was able to be heat-set. The edition was 446,000 copies. Continuing to do research with APHA, the International Printing Ink Company, RR Donnelley developed during the 40s and 50s newer and better versions of heat-set inks. These inks allowed the paper coming off a web letterpress to pass over heated drums which dried the ink immediately. This allowed the speed of the press to be increased dramatically. When printing millions of magazines a month, this was crucially important. Like Judd and Detweiler had done before them, R. Donnelley published in '89 a book of the history of the printing company. A number of the following images on R. Donnelley's period of printing the magazine are from this book. When the society realized that they had to get a new printer to keep up with ever-increasing membership, Donnelley was ready. They were ideally situated in Midwest and Mid-Country and right at the heart of a booming Chicago economy. By 1917, they had already built this enormous printing facility. This was the very deluxe corporate library at that Calumet plant. A salesman heading out the front door to bring in some work for the presses. As I mentioned earlier, color separation techniques were still relatively crude compared with other advancements in printing. Better panchromatic litho films were still being perfected, and digital scanners were still only an idea in some RCA engineers' brains. If not mechanically done, all separations were made optically through red, green, and blue filters as they had always been done, but the filters themselves were still not perfect, and there was cross-color contamination, which made colors dirty, especially greens and certain blues. Photographic masking was not developed until the 50s, so all color correction was done manually by photo etching or by hand-cut or hand-painted masks. R. Donnelley had web letterpress equipment since the early 30s, but what allowed them to make the bid for and win the National Geographic contract was the greatly increased speed of the presses, due not only to the fact that it was web versus sheet-fed, but again that they had inline heat-set dryers. When I originally proposed this talk to APHA, I had thought that the transition from Judd and Detweiler had signaled the change from process letterpress to offset or gravure. As I learned from my research at NGS, the printing method, process letterpress, actually continued all the way until 1978, which was astonishing news to me. The decision by the NGS was made to stay with letterpress since the improved speed with web instead of sheet-fed, plus the increased speed from the heat-set inks made sense to them as the next revolutionary step in technology that they understood. Unlike offset, which had plates that would only last for about a 500,000 run before breaking down, the letterpress plates like rotogravure held up for incredibly long runs. Only a few months after R. Donnelley started printing the magazine, color images started being placed on the covers. The covers were also printed by web heat-set letterpress, but on 100-pound coated cover rather than the 60-pound coated text on the inside. Later, the covers would all be printed by offset, but in smaller lots because the advertising on the inside and on the back cover were regional, and this made the smaller numbers viable. By January of '62, the color had already taken over the entire inside of the framed contents block, giving it a much more modern look. The color in the Donnelley years retains the slightly heavy, slightly dirty color typical of a lot of four-color letterpress printing, and remained typical of what we think of as 50s National Geographic color. In the 70s, the advertising sections, including the cover, as I mentioned earlier, contained regional advertising contents, and those were printed by web offset. They're the only parts to this day that are printed offset. The letterpress era ended in transition year 1977 to 78. W.F. Hall was R.R. Donnelley's principal rival and grew to be an enormous company by printing, among other things, mail-order catalogs, including the Montgomery Ward catalog and, of course, later, the National Geographic. The executive offices were at the front of this building, and there were 969 cylinder presses and 132 rotary web presses. W.F. Hall owned a division that did the web rotogravure work called Chicago Rotoprint. It was in the north section of the plant pictured in the previous slide. The National Geographic Magazine had reached a circulation of 8 million in 1970, and by 1975, 9 million. A search started for a rotogravure printer who could handle the increased numbers. The NGS was approached with a proposal to convert the magazine to high-speed rotogravure. The new contract brought to an end the 90-year history of the magazine being printed by letterpress. Web offset couldn't handle the huge runs each month to the NGS. Rotogravure was the only answer for the magazine's future, and so during the 77-78 years the magazine made the switch. The magazine was printed originally at Chicago Rotoprint, but the deal was signed with W.F. Hall to build an entirely new plant to be called Hall of Mississippi, down where the labor and land was cheap, and with all brand new, latest technology, rotogravure presses. At the same time as the switch to newer and faster printing technologies, the electronic and digital age came to prepress. Early drum scanners, first developed by RCA and Hell in the 50s, became practical and affordable in the 70s and transformed the industry. Magnification of the rotogravure dots from an issue of the National Geographic Magazine here after the switch to rotogravure. Rotogravure has the highest amount of ink transference of any printing medium. Although the shadows have to have a dot for the cylinders to hold ink, the sheer amount of pigment going down yields terrific blacks. Indeed, the shadows tend to be rather dark and dense due to the amount of ink. A modern rotogravure press of the type used today to print the National Geographic. The magazine today, at 5 million circulation, is still printed by rotogravure, and there's no challenger to this medium in terms of quality for that sort of very long production run. Many thanks to the following people: Amelia Hugel Fontenelle, Kathy Hunter, Bernie Quarrick, Hans Wegner. Thank you.